I just want to take a moment this morning before we begin to say a word of gratitude for our emerging leaders. I'm so grateful for Matt and for Michelle, and certainly for you, Ernest, as you've graduated from emerging leader to Brown Bar intern. I just feel that we're so lucky and privileged to have you with us. And already on your second Sunday, you two have stepped up considerably. And it's great fun to be able to worship with you. Last week we talked a little bit about the meaning of the word here as a starting point in the spiritual life. Getting here, beginning right where we are, with all our nagging doubts and fears and questions, all those things that we bring into the richness of our spiritual lives and the spiritual matters of our life. We begin here where we are. So often I think we believe that we have to organize our lives and our beliefs, get everything together in a manageable circle or ball, looking like we have it all together before we decide we can really commit ourselves to the spiritual quest or even be part of a church community. The question that I raised last week is, can we embrace the very moment that we are living and all that is in that moment, the here and now of our existence, the bumps and the bruises, our doubts, our faith, our good intentions, and then all those things that we have left undone, all bringing us into the moment, into the journey, into spiritual community. Just after I preached that sermon, I read a story about a woman who declared that she woke up a Christian and went to bed an atheist, seeing that life was a long to and fro, inward and outward movement of the Spirit, that within her life there was plenty of faith and plenty of doubt, and she was learning to accept it all. Some of us here this morning know exactly how she feels. Others of us can hardly imagine what life would be like without that solid bedrock of faith that we feel is under us and around us. And most of us, I believe, understand what it means to grapple with everyday matters of our existence and our meaning, and the meaning of our beliefs, and God help us, our unbeliefs. Brian McLaren's book, which I mentioned last week, Naked Spirituality, bids us to begin here, where we are, naming the present as holy and powerful. The question that I want to deal with this morning, then, is how do we get from here to there? By that I mean, how do we bring the who that we are in this way into our relationships and into community? Our gospel lesson describes how we are called to live together, to find ways to be with each other, to be whole and present in the midst of community. It names right relationship with each other as our essential task, and living in community, whatever community we are a part of, family, neighborhood, church, friends, citizens, global citizens, all of it can be wonderful. And also it can be so very demanding and difficult. Living together requires openness, flexibility, generosity, humility, and mutual forbearance. And it also requires a fair dose of forgiveness. In our story today, just prior to our reading, Peter has received the keys of the kingdom from Jesus. So you can imagine that Peter, in this conversation with Jesus, is feeling pretty frisky and pretty full of himself. When Peter asks Jesus how strong his forgiveness muscle should be, how many times he has to be open in community and open to another person before he can say, enough, I've had enough of all this, it's a natural question. How much is enough before our reservoir of grace is exhausted? before we want to turn our backs, before we simply have to say, that is not my problem. I'm heading on. It is plenty just to handle our own lives, isn't it? Without having to take into account our relationship with others. So Peter starts off by offering what he thinks is a high bar, a significant amount of forgiveness for those who have hurt us in community. Peter says, well, Jesus, how about 7 times? I'm sure he's impressed by his own generosity and his big-heartedness. And after all, most of us think we are doing pretty good if we can get to the first and maybe the only, I'm sorry, please forgive me. Jesus can be so irritating. He responds to Peter with a radical proposal. In different translations, it suggests different ways of looking at this moment. Not 7, but 7 times 77 in some translations. Do the math. That's 490 times. Check me out. I asked Sam to do this for me. He may have made a mistake. Of course, he isn't suggesting that we literally record those 77 plus offenses and our big, fat, generous responses of forgiveness. He isn't even asking for a tolerant spirit in the midst of conflict. Instead, Jesus is offering us a vision of there, a community built upon grace, created by love, and served through constant acts of forgiveness and mercy. Served through openness to each other and a declaration of peace to reign among and within us. This teaching could be abused. Forgiveness does not mean embracing violence against us and allowing it to continue. This week we have only to look at the Ravens football player Ray Rice and the incident of this past week to realize that this society must no longer tolerate violence against women or anyone, no matter how famous and successful the man. And forgiveness doesn't mean we get a free rein on our own meanness or pettiness or cruelty just because we can always be forgiven. Nor does it mean that we carry our hurt around inside us, resentfully and silently, holding on tightly until it begins to destroy us. What it does mean, I believe, is a willingness to come to the awareness that we live in an amazing state of grace, not in the curse of our worst tendencies as human beings, but in the vast ocean of the sea of God. How could survivors of the German death camps ever come to some sense of forgiveness for the awfulness that took place? Yet many survivors over the years have spoken of memories of kindness that was given and received among prisoners, and from some others who withstood the tyranny of evil, who made it possible to stay alive, to stay human, to stay in the realm of forgiveness. Traditionally, this text has been interpreted by many to say something like this: God has forgiven us so many times for our mistakes and for our failings. We now are called upon in God's name to forgive others, even as we live in a state of forgiveness. For me, this is a bit too personal of a God who dispenses forgiveness from the King of the universe throne onto his subjects. The grace in the act of forgiveness isn't so cheap, in the sense that forgiveness is freely and abundantly given. Grace is both more necessary and far more precious than my simply being able to say, God is gracious, therefore I will be gracious too. Some days I comprehend the gift of my life and I'm able to bask in the sun of the grace I know is God. And other days I'm so befuddled and made helpless by the hardness of the world, and even by my own hardness, I scarcely know how to crawl forward to accept the gift. Sometimes I'm able to meet those I love with openness and grace, and other times I'm stuck, and I can't find my way out of my shell, out of the way forward. That I can, every once in a while, realize the great gift of life and the privilege it is to live and to love others, then I'm beginning to know and understand this grace. That I can actually get there, come into this state of awareness of my own forgivenness and my ability to forgive. This is when grace comes alive in me. Jim Wallace tells a story of apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s, when Nelson Mandela was still in prison, and many South Africans wondered if peace and justice would ever be able to break through the violence and the oppression that was consuming the lives of millions. Ordinary school children in South Africa in those days were victims daily of a terrible war and violence, and many were killed and murdered in the townships. Sometimes those children were coming or going from school. Still, it was the children who seemed to have an unusual sense of grace and purpose in the midst of such terror and transgression. Wallace spoke with a 14-year-old boy in one of the townships, and he asked him if he believed in the future of his country and if there would be a free and peaceful South Africa one day. He asked him if it was possible after all this, could people forgive each other and could they learn how to live together? The boy looked at Jim Wallace and answered matter-of-factly, "Yes, sir, I shall see to it personally." For me, this boy lived in a state of perpetual grace. In the midst of such violence and terror, rather than hunkering down or cowering in fear, he and so many others were able to live toward the hope of something good and a free South Africa. Desmond Tutu has written since that time that there can be in each life and in the life of nations no future without forgiveness. I sense that the spirit of forgiveness came alive in that young boy, even in the midst of oppression, violence, and fear. Forgiveness was alive in that human soul. How do we get from here to there? Jesus dared to be awake in his spirit in the midst of his own struggle. He was awake to the pain and the beauty he saw each day in the people and in the world around him. And he was awake to his own desire for transformation, and I think he might have been awake to his own need to be forgiven, for he asked a lot of his friends and a lot from his community. He must have offended them. He must have hurt them at times. And then Jesus gives us this amazing example, his final ability and power to forgive. From this spiritual depth, he was able to ask for the improbable from himself and from others. As we open ourselves, as we awake to a new season of life in community and in our families and relationships with each other, and as we awake to the everyday challenge of living in this world, perhaps the only place we can start is personally, here. Yes, sir, I shall see to it personally. Here we begin, daring to trust in the awful grace of God, who is always moving us there. Amen.